Bruchim haboim, welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. Starting with Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, 2 lines from the bottom. The Gemara had previously brought a case that Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, where a person who takes a korban osham, he wants to then bring the korban osham as a kapar for himself, and lo and behold, either he dies or the osham gets lost. So in this scenario where the osham gets lost, he buys a new osham, he offers that as a korban, and his yotze, his choiv, as the korban osham. Subsequently, he finds the old osham. The protocol is that he's supposed to take that osham, let it graze, get a mum kavua, then sell that osham, take the proceeds, and use those proceeds to buy a korban oila for the tzibur. Rav says that if a person took that osham and then he shechted it, meaning before it became got a mum, he went ahead and shechted it. So Rav says if he shechted it even stam, it's a kosher oila. Again, the chiddush being, the Gemara points out, that he did not have to make an akira. He did not have to then change the status and say it's the shame korban oila. The very fact that he shechts it stam, automatically it's enough to then make it a korban oila, kosher korban. Ask the Gemara from our Mishnah, and that's why we brought this case. Eisvei Rav Chizda Rav Huna. Now Rav Chizda asks from our Mishnah, it states, Shachtoi v'noida l'shem moshchoi bailim es yodam. The case in the end of our Mishnah states, when one shechs a korban Pesach, and he shechs it for a certain chabura, and after the shechita, he is told that that chabura, they took themselves out of the chabura, and therefore there's no chabur they shechted for. Or that chabura all became tameh, or they all died. So that shechita was invalid. But of course, since the one who shechted the korban Pesach did not know and did not have any reason to know that this would take place, it's considered to be an oines, and the Mishnah rules that he is potter from a korban chatas when he shechs that on Shabbos. On top of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. V'tani Allah. Now we have a brisa that explains our Mishnah. Bechol ki haygavno yisarif miyad. If this took place during a weekday, then he'd have to burn that korban Pesach right away. That korban right away. Now Gemara now builds up its question on Rav. I amris bishlama boy akira. If you said that it requires an akira, then it's very well, because then by requiring the akira, if he did not make an akira, then it remains a korban Pesach. Hai Pesachu v'kivin the lesle bailim havale psuloi begufoi amtu lahochi yisarif miyad. And since it's a korban Pesach, which does not have a bailim, therefore it's a korban that's pasul, whereby intrinsically in the goof of the korban itself there's a psul, allowing therefore to then be burnt immediately. In other words, we'll soon see in a brisa that the only way you can burn a korban immediately is if the korban itself intrinsically is possible. But if it's possible for an outside reason, like the brisa will say, for example, the dam was spilled and never made it to the mizbeach, then you cannot burn the korban right away. So the Gemara says that would be then bishlama if you say that it requires an akira. Eliyam is loy boy akira. But if you say that there's no requirement for an akira, that automatically this korban became a korban shlamim, then mereisha avale shlamim psula mishum mai. Why is it possible? Mishum davar acher, only for an outside reason. The koshachi le achar tamisho ben har boyim, because it was shechted after the korban tamid. We know that all korbanos must be shechted before the korban tamisho ben har boyim, with the exception of a korban Pesach. So this korban was shechted after it was a shlamim, because automatically we're suggesting that it became a shlamim. Therefore, it was shechted after the korban tamishal ben arbaim as a shlamim, and that itself is an iser. So it's an outside reason why there's a psul over here. In which case, the Gemara says, ibur tzura boy. It requires that the tzura, the features of the animal, its appearance, that it goes ahead and changes. Now it has to be you have to wait and give it some time before you then burn it, until it then has the time of its towards the next day, or it's whereby the appearance changes, or halachically it needs to be burned. Al Koponim, you don't burn it right away. Titania, Zaklal. Now the Brisa brings the klal to show you that only when it's intrinsically possible can you burn it right away. But if it's from an outside reason why it's possible, that has to be then weighted as an ibor tzura. Says the Brisa, Zaklal, koshe psuloi begufoy. When there's an intrinsic psul in the animal itself, then yisarf miyad. Then we can burn it right away. Bidam u'bebailim. If, however, there's a problem because of the dam, like we said, the dam spilled, or the bailim became tamei, or the bailim died. First, you have to let the appearance change. In other words, give it some time, and then only afterwards burn the carbon. So now we're left with the question: if Rav Huna is saying in the name of Rav that the carbon that he was talking about before does not need akira, then over here it's a kasha based on this brisa, because this brisa is saying that if it does not need akira, then it became a shlomim. If it became a shlomim, the only reason why you have to then, the only way you can go and burn it is only if you give it some time. And that's not what the brisa says. The brisa says you have to burn it right away. So clearly we're talking about a case, according to the brisa, where indeed you do need to make akira. And since you do need to make akira, we're talking about in the brisa that it was still a carbon pesach, and therefore it's intrinsically possible. Because it was intrinsically possible, you can burn it right away. Ella, says the Gemara, to explain on behalf of Rav why the brisa is not going to be a question on him, is because lo teima shachto istam kosher lishum oila. Ella ema shachto lishum oila kosher. You have to change the words that we had in the name of Rav. When Rav Huna said the name of Rav that he shechtu stam, it's kosher as an oila. No, he meant that he shechted l'shem oila, it's kosher. Dahainu, he did make an akira. Alma boy akira. And therefore that shtims together with our brisa. The Gemara says, however, Rabbi Chia bar Gamda, Rabbi Chia bar Gamda, he said that there was an unanimous statement that was made by the Chabura. In a case where the owners of a Korban Pesach became Tamei Meis, and therefore they could not bring the Korban Pesach in its rightful time, Yudalid ben Nisan, so then it's pushed off to Yudalid B'Iyar, what's called Pesach Sheni. So there he says, since that Korban Pesach can be used for the Korban Pesach Sheni, so it remains the same Korban Pesach, hasn't changed its status. Therefore, if you change its status, you have to make an Akira. Is mashma that all other cases you do not have to make an Akira. It changes on its own automatically. Says the Gemara. They said, then then this would require an Akira. The only reason that it needs that Akira is because it's Tamei Mesim. It was designated as a carbon, and it can be used now as a carbon Pesach Sheni. So if you want to take it out of its status, it needs Akira. Whereas all other carbon Pesach does not need Akira. According to this, what are you going to say? Here, it's implying that you do not need Akira like we originally understood Rav. Elo Amar Vahuna B'Reid Rav Yoshua. Hacha b'mayaskinon. This brisa is talking about the following: Kigon shehifrishu koidem chatzois umeisu bailim achar chatzois dehavale nira v'nidcha. Because nira nidcha shuv eino choyze v'nira. The Gemara explains that the brisa is talking about a scenario. Why do you have to burn it right away? Because it's talking about a scenario where before chatzois hayoim on Yud Dalid, the animal was separated to be used for a carbon pesach. It was designated as a carbon pesach. After Chatzois, the Bailim died. Then it became Posul because the Bailim died. So says the Gemara that this Bryce is talking about a case of Dichui. Since the animal, the carbon pesach, became invalid as a carbon pesach because the Bailim died, therefore we have a principle that Kol Shenira V'nidche Shuv Eino Choyze V'nira, and therefore it remains a psul no longer can be used as a carbon. So therefore, that's why over here, intrinsically, even if you want to say, like Rav did say, that the Brisa is talking about where you could go ahead and it's does not read an akira. It's automatic. But over here, it remains a korban pesach because the bailim died, and therefore it's a case of dichui. And that's why you have to burn it right away. Says the Gemara, that's not going to work over here as an answer for Rav, because midi hu detayma el Rav. We want to come to explain Rav, who says that it does not require an akira. And that's why we're explaining this brisa in such a way that doesn't have an akira, but it's a case of dichui, and that's why you can burn it right away. Although it remains a korban pesach, but because it remains a korban pesach, even though normally it would change to be the status of a korban shlami, here it doesn't because of dichui. But ha'omar Rav by lichayim einam didchim. This won't work to explain Rav, because Rav says when the animal is alive, we don't say dichui. When do we say dichui? When there's a psul in the korban after it was already shechted. But if the animal is still alive, then we don't say the principle kol anira v'nidche shuv eino choyzer v'nira. And therefore this won't be then a way to explain the brisa on behalf of Rav. Ella says the Gemara Amar Rav Papa. Rather, Rav Papa said the following: Hamani Rebbe Eliezer. This brisa is Rebbe Eliezer, and that's why it's not going to be a kasha on Rav. This brisa that says that you shech the animal right away can also shtim with Rav, who says that you do not need to make an akira. The Omar, because Rebbe Eliezer says v'chein hashoichet acherim l'shem pesach pasul. Rebbe Eliezer is of the shita that if you shech a korban, let's say a korban shlomim, for the sake of a korban pesach, it's pasul. Why? Dahavale psuloi begufoi, and he holds that it's a psul in the guf itself. It's invalid in the guf itself, and therefore, although it now was indeed a korban shlomim, because we said it does not need an akira, and that shtims with Rav, the Brisa says it does not need akira, became a korban shlomim, and because it came a korban shlomim, and he shechted as a korban pesach, therefore it has intrinsically psul according to Rabbi Eliezer, whereby you can burn it right away. Ask the Gemara, but still, the Rabbi Eliezer, if you're going to say to Rabbi Eliezer that you burn the korban pesach right away during the week, if it was shechted during the week, chachat is nami mechayiv. But when it was on Shabbos, our Mishnah said that he's potter, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, he would be chayiv. Why? Because the whole lesson of Rabbi Eliezer toye b'dvar mitzvah potter. Since he holds that somebody who's toye b'dvar mitzvah is chayiv, therefore he would say that over here that it would be chayiv. And our brisa is talking about a case where the Mishnah is speaking about where if he did it on Shabbos, he would be potter. So therefore it does not shtim with Rabbi Eliezer either. The Gemara now brings a final conclusion to support Rav, which is really along the same lines of what we just said in Rabbi Eliezer, as follows: Elatargam of Rabbi Yosef Bered Rav Salach Hasido Kamed Rav Popet Hamani Yosef ben Chanoi Hi. Our brisa over here is Rabbi Yossi ben Chanoi. Disnan, like it says in the following Mishnah, his opinion. Yosef ben Chanoi Omer Hanishchotin l'shem Pesach v'l'shem Chatas Psulin. One who takes an animal, let's say a korban shlomim, and he shechs the korban Pesach, that is going to be pasul, just like the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. Alma psula begufoi hu umishum hochi yisar miyad. So here, even if we want to say that indeed it doesn't need an akira, just like Rav says, but over here it became a korban shlomim. As a korban shlomim, when he shechs it for a korban pesach, it's intrinsically pasul, whereby you're allowed to then saref it miyad. So therefore we understand this brisa, and it's not now going to be a kasha on Rav. But we asked a question of Rabbi Eliezer before. What about if it was done on Shabbos? It would be potter, and Rabbi Eliezer says chayiv, because he holds, Rabbi Eliezer's shita is that one who's toyeh b'dvar mitzvah, v'oiseh mitzvah, is still going to be chayiv. What about over here according to this shita? Gemara explains, but this sheet of Yosef ben Chanoi holds like Rabbi Yoshua, that somebody who's toyeh b'dvar mitzvah, also mitzvah, is going to be potter. So now we have our answer. We found how to explain the brisa, and it's not going to be a kasha on Rav. Rav Ashi wants to suggest that indeed Rav holds like a different Tana. The Gemara is going to reject this, but the Gemara is going to suggest, according to Rav Ashi, that this is a mahalach. Rav the Omar Rabbi Shmuel Benoi Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika. Rav holds like this Tana. The Tana, like it says in the following brisa, Rabbi Shmuel Benoi Rabbi Yochanan ben Broika Oimer. He says, Gabe, one who shechs the korban Pesach on Shabbos, Im yesh shuhus biyom leida im joshchoy bailim es yedeim oishem meisoy shemesu oshe nitmeu chayev. You're talking about a case like the latter part of our Mishnah, the Seif of our Mishnah, where he shechs the Korban Pesach for a certain chabura, and then after he shechs it, he's told that the chabura then took themselves away outside, and they're no longer included in the chabura, they excluded themselves from the chabura, or that they died, or that they became tamei. So the Bryce over here states that if he knew that there's going to be enough time, there was enough time for him to know that this took place before he shechted the Korban Pesach, then he's going to be chayv a Korban Chatos. The Gemara says, Utu ubar tzuroso, if it was during the week, then he'd have to then make an ubar tzuroso, he'd have to leave it till it changes his appearance, v'yoytze lebeis hasreif, and then burn it. So the Gemara says, my time, why is the reason why he'd have to wait and not burn it immediately? Lav mishum deloy boy akira, is it not because it does not require akira? In other words, the fact that it's now remains something does not require akira means that now it became a korban shlomim. As a korban shlomim over here, the only reason why it's possible is because it's brought after the korban tamishal ben ha'arboyim, an outside type of psul, whereby you can't burn it right away. You have to leave it to bar tzurosoi. So now l'chara we have found that Rav can go like this brisa, like the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Rabbi Yechon ben Broika. The Gemara now challenged this suggestion. Memai dilma mishum desaver lo ketan de Rabbi Bar Avua. Maybe that this Tana, Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Rabbi Yechon ben Broika, says to ubar tzuroso because he holds like this other Tana, the Omar, who says afilu pigul nami boy iber tzura. Even when there's an intrinsic psul in the animal itself, that also requires uber tzuroso. In other words, this is different than what we said before. It's choylek on the brisa that we quoted before that makes a distinction and says if it's a intrinsic psul, you can burn it right away. This shita holds, the Tana, the Bei Rabbi Bar Avua, is that even if it has an intrinsic psul, you also have to wait until it changes its appearance to then burn it. And therefore, it does require akira. According to Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher, Rabbi Yechon ben Broika, it does require an akira, but over here we're talking about whereas a korban pesach, and as a korban pesach, even though it has an intrinsic psul, you couldn't burn it right away because of this shita that you have to let it be ibur tzura. The yalif oven mi noisar, he learns the shita from the fact there's a gzeir shava from noisar. Just as noisar has to be that is leftover meat, so too this psul also, which is intrinsic, would also have to be left over. That if you're not going to say this, now the Gemara is going to prove that it has to be that in akira, that indeed an akira is made. As follows. What are you going to say about the case of nitmu bailim? Again, Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Rabbi Yechon ben Broika was talking about a case where somebody shechted a korban pesach for a chabura who either excluded themselves from the chabura, or died, or became tamei. They became tamei meis. So, what are you going to say? Havade boy akira. There, if they're tamei, they need an akira. Like we learned before, that when there are those who become tamei, the korban pesach still retains its status as the korban pesach because it's going to then be used as a korban pesach for Pesach Sheni 1 month later. And therefore, if you want to change the status, you have to make an akira. The entire chabur unanimously said that you have to be oiker if you want to change its status. So therefore, it must be that we're talking about a case where there is an akira in this case of Rabbi Shmuel ben Osher Rabbi Yechon ben Broika, and therefore, just as we said, is not going to then shtim with Rav. Ella, therefore, mechavarto kedashani mikara. Not like Rav Ashi taught, but rather like the Hamahal that we said before, Yosef ben Chanoi, that it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Chanoi who says when you take a korban shlomim, because it was automatically changed from a korban pesach to a korban shlomim, but you then check that as a korban pesach, then it becomes intrinsically possible, whereby you're allowed to then burn it right away. And that shtims again with Rav, who says they don't not need to make an akira automatically when you shech that korban osham. Stam is going to be kosher as a korban oila. Hadron aloch elu devarim.